In addition to users and groups in Azure AD, you can also track devices. So a device is a computer, like a mobile, tablet, or a PC, which a user uses to authenticate to Azure AD. You don't add these devices, but you can manage them in Azure AD. You can see the operating system that's being used and version. You can see what's called a join type, which we'll talk about shortly. And you can enable and disable these devices. Let me show you in the portal what this looks like. So in my Azure Active Directory, if I go down to Devices and click on All Devices, I don't have any listed here because I haven't used any devices to connect to this particular tenant, but you can see the menu choices here at the top include Enable, Disable, and Delete. These are nice ways to be able to manage the device. You might want to disable the device, for example, if it's a phone and somebody notifies you that they've lost their phone. So disabling that device would prevent the login to Azure AD from that device. You can also see device settings here, and device settings take us to information about the join type. So let's talk about join types now. So there's 3 join types for devices in Azure AD: registered, joined, and hybrid joined. And these are good to be able to sort differences for your exam. So a registered device can be Windows 10, iOS, Android, or Mac OS. Those are the allowed operating systems. Registered is sort of the first level of join type, and potentially any device that logs into Azure AD will show up as registered in Azure AD. The device itself can be owned by the user. It could be owned by your organization. It is possible to do single sign-on from these devices, but only single sign-on to the cloud, which means single sign-on to Azure AD itself. In the picture you can see here, like a bring your own laptop or a mobile device could both fall in these categories as being able to authenticate into Azure AD and therefore be registered. A join device type is Windows 10 or Windows 11, but not the Home Edition. So already there's quite a restriction here where you're not allowed to use iOS, Android, Mac, anything but Windows 10. It's assumed to be an org-owned device. The SSO can happen to Azure AD as shown in the picture. Could also happen to on-prem Active Directory, but through Azure AD. So notice there's one line here that goes from the org-owned laptop to Azure AD. So the authentication happens there. Azure AD may communicate with your on-prem Active Directory to finish the authorization or authentication, but that Windows 10 is the only OS that can be joined. Now, hybrid joined is just a modification of that. So this is for not only Windows 10 or 11, but also for the so-called down-level clients. So if you're running Windows 8.1 or Windows 7, these devices also are organization owned, and they can do SSO to Azure AD. They can also talk to your Active Directory domain services on premises. So it could be a laptop in the office, something like that. So hybrid joined has this notion of being able to authenticate to either directory, either Azure AD in the cloud or your on-prem AD. Let's talk about some scenarios for this. For a registered device, maybe a consultant that needs access to resources. And so it's a computer they own. It's not a computer that your organization owns. So the consultant could have a registered device. Perhaps a user accesses email from a personal phone. For joined devices, this could be used for organizations that don't have an on-prem Active Directory. And so hybrid joined is not a choice in that case. And so the authentication could happen to Azure AD. Often these are used for organizations that don't synchronize with on-prem AD, but they do have Microsoft 365. Hybrid join devices, probably the primary use for this would be the down-level client. So they don't have Windows 10, they're running Windows 8.1 or 7 on the desktop, but you may still want to control or manage the device, allow synchronization or authorization against both. And so hybrid join could be your choice for that. Another reason you might do hybrid join devices is because you have Windows AD group policy and you want to be able to apply that to those down-level devices. Here's finally a flowchart that summarizes this information. Let's just notice that to get to registered, how you get down here in the lower left corner is you're on something like iOS, macOS, or Android, right? So those devices, since it's not running Windows, there's limit choices. You can't do either of the join types. You have to use a registered. Interesting to note under this no option here for no Azure AD options could be a Linux OS. So in order to get to hybrid Azure AD join, perhaps it's a down-level device. So it's Windows, but it's not Windows 10. You can also get there if it is Windows 10, but it's domain joined, and the worker is not remote, then you could still end up with Azure AD join. To get to Azure AD join itself without the hybrid part, it is Windows 10, it's not domain joined, you don't have any group policy requirements, you could choose to use Azure AD join. So for test purposes, I would focus mostly on the kind of device it is in a way that might control which kind of join type you could use.